Okay, I'll call us to order. I see Ken coming, and we will begin. Minutes from the last meeting. Has anyone had a chance to look at them?
I couldn't find them this morning at home.
Okay, John moved to accept them. Is there a second?
Second.
Ken DeBoer, second.
Okay.
All those in favor of the minutes as presented, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, passed. Okay, we have a speaker this morning. Fred Von
Mecco.
Mecco. Okay. He's going to talk with us about the Chenango Land Trust. So I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. I'll start out by giving you a brief history of the Chenango Land Trust, and then I have brochures to give out that describe the land trust a little bit, and then I want to show you all a map of the properties that we have protected in Chenango and Broome counties. So in 1992, Mr. Rob DeClue, whom many of you know, was the chairman of the Environmental Management Council Land Use Committee, and he suggested that the committee look into forming a land trust since there was no land trust that served this area. And all the members at that time, which included me, thought it was a great idea, and so we formed the Chenango Land Trust. We were incorporated in 1994. We had a brief moment of tension when the IRS determined that we might not be a charitable organization, and so we had to prove to them that we were mostly publicly funded, and so 5 years after we were incorporated, we became a permanent nonprofit organization in the eyes of the IRS. Our first Land Steward Awards were presented in 1996, and that year we also began an educational program called Exploring Chenango County, which some of you may remember from the late 1990s, early 2000s, where we took field trips throughout Chenango County and gave people a little bit of a familiarity with some of the state forest lands, some private lands that were unique where we could get permission to take people on them and things like that. Our first easement, conservation easement, and I'll explain what those are in greater detail. We acquired in 1997 in Pharsalia, and over the 21 years since then, we have acquired 9 more easements, so we now have 10 conservation easements, and we own 2 pieces of property, notably 20 acres in McCall's Pond in the town of Preston, and that property is a wetland, and it's kind of remarkable that the town of Preston calls it a property, actually, because it's all underwater. But it is very unique because it has a lot of bog-like characteristics, and of course the Chenango Land Trust is very interested in protecting unique habitats, and so that's a nice one. And then one of our best acquisitions was the Chenango Canal Lock 99, and many of you probably are familiar with Chenango Canal Lock 99 on the south side of Oxford, which is the best preserved canal lock on the entire Chenango Canal system, which had 116 locks between Utica and Binghamton. So we're very pleased to be able to protect that Chenango Canal lock, and we're hoping that we can at some point put a small parking area in near that with a spur trail going to it, because the Chenango Canal Lock 99 is located only 400 yards off the Finger Lakes Trail. So it would be fabulous to have a little spur trail going off the Finger Lakes Trail to the canal lock and have a little historic interpretation there so that hikers on the trail could see the canal lock. And get a little canal history as they were walking the trail.
What's in South Oxford?
The place farm, Mike, or not Mike, Martha and
Okay, Martha and Richard Place?
Richard, if you look
This
just
is-
east of them.
This is directly to the north, land that used to be owned by Barb Ingram.
But
Don't know the Ingrams.
It's
So
near
the
the-
place
South
is
Oxford Bridge.
South
Yeah, I
South
know
Oxford
South
Bridge.
Oxford Bridge up above it then.
Yeah,
a little
north
bit
of that.
north of
And
that.
Martha Place has about 20 acres on the north side, and this is just exactly to the north of that, on 20 acres. So it's 400 yards north of the South Oxford Bridge Road. We are currently negotiating our next easement, which is actually located in the town of Hamilton. And the reason we've kind of branched into Hamilton is because that property is owned by the Southern Madison Heritage Trust, which is the land trust that covers Hamilton, town of Hamilton. But a land trust cannot both own and hold the conservation easement on a property. So, that would be a conflict of interest if they were monitoring themselves. And so we have to hold the conservation easement on the property that they own. So we have a sort of a reciprocal agreement with them. So if we were ever to put a conservation easement, for example, on the McCall's Pond property or on the Chenango Canal Lock property that we own, we would have to find another organization to hold the conservation easement on that because we wouldn't be able to monitor our own property. So let me talk a little bit about conservation easements. Conservation easements are an agreement between a landowner and the land trust whereby the landowner donates away development rights. So the land becomes slightly less in value, and in many cases it becomes substantially less in value, and I'll give you an example of that in a moment. But because you've donated away development rights, the land cannot be developed, and so therefore the appraised value is diminished because it doesn't have the same amount of value if it can't be developed. So the land gets protected. The landowner retains all the rights to use the property. There is no public access unless the landowner specifically requests it. Conservation easements last in perpetuity, so once an easement is placed on the land, it goes with the land forever. Feel free to interrupt me and ask questions if you have any questions about the conservation easement.
Who pays the taxes?
The landowner continues to own the land and use the land and therefore pays all the taxes on the land. However, the taxes could be reduced because of the loss of development rights, and the assessor has to determine whether or not.
If there's a loss. I'm the county director of real property tax services as the assessor in Casanova for 16 years. They have a large Casanova preservation
Right. They have
foundation.
30-some properties there.
And just so people aren't, there may be some reduction in value, but in New York State, property's valued to its current use. So if you have a farm, it's valued as farmland, not for its build-out potential. And when the easements are given, there's usually an appraisal done and they'll look at it for build-out potential. If you have 100 acres, they'll value it, they'll look at it and say, well, reasonably you could get X number of lots and establish a value on it and compare it to the value now, and that's the tax benefit that you get as far as for writing that donation off. But most of the properties here are valued at current use, not for their build-out potential. So,
Okay.
and that's required by law. The assessor can't look at your farm and say you have 50 lots, so 10,000 times 50 or whatever the number is.
So the value to the property owner?
The value to the property owner is that you can take a charitable donation equal to the value of the loss of value of the property. So, in other words, if an appraiser determines that your property has a potential value of, just to pull a number out of the air, $200,000, you put an easement on the property which lowers the value of the property. Let's say it lowers it by $50,000. You have just made a $50,000 donation
Contribution.
Yeah.
to the land trust, which is a charitable donation, a deductible charitable donation. Now, the tax laws, of course, are changing, and I can't speak for
Right.
what they are
I think
now.
charitable's still in there, but,
Yeah. So the dairy farmer that's already losing money, that's really not a benefit to him.
Well,
It
it
could be if he
depends.
had a river flat.
it depends on that
It
deduction.
depends, yeah. I mean, it could be. The easement that we just completed in the town of Guilford, there was 79 acres right on Guilford Lake, and some of it is used as pasture land.
It's used as hayland.
It's used as hayland, that's right, I'm sorry. And the appraiser valued that land at $750,000 or something like that, because
Right.
you know, a
'Cause of
lot
the
of it
lake
is right on
access,
Guilford
right.
Lake. Well, after he donated the easement on it and it can't be developed, the value
Kinda
dropped down to $250,000. He just took a $500,000 donation
Yeah.
that he can deduct off of his taxes. And that can be spread out over 5 years, because you can't take it all at once.
Okay.
You can only deduct up to 30% of your income in a given year, but you can spread it out over 5 years. So, there are potentially tax benefits.
Okay. Thanks.
I just don't want people to think that they're automatically, because I used
No.
to run into that a lot. For
That-
appraisal methodology, for a fee appraiser, the fee appraiser appraises land highest and best use. So
Right.
that's to build out
Right.
capability.
Right.
Or an assessor, it's the current use. So if it's a golf course, gets appraised as a golf course. If it's a farm, gets, or I should say assessed as a farm, and so on.
Thanks.
Right. And the example I gave is the extreme high end. In most cases in this area, there is little to no reduction in the assessed value. So the property taxes don't change, but the appraised value could
Right.
change, which is where you see the
And it's also
Benefit.
locked up so that if you pass away, somebody else can't come in and split it all up and develop it.
that's correct.
I think that's the big plus.
In perpetuity, we also, one of the clauses that we write into every conservation easement is that there is no subdivision
Right.
once the easement is in place. So the property must retain its
So-
full acreage.
So what the current landowner passes away, turns the property over to a distant relative, by will or something. That person cannot develop the property.
Correct.
He is just handed a piece of property that for development reasons is worthless.
True.
Well, yes, except that in some cases, on some of the easements, it's appropriate to allow for maybe one house to be built or something like that. And so what we'll do is we'll carve out from the piece of property a small building envelope.
And this can be done later, after this original easement?
No, it has to be written into the original easement. Once the easement is in place,
That's it.
You don't
it doesn't change
Good.
unless there is legal action. And then judges are disinclined to change easements unless it's in the public interest. And very seldom is that the case.
So historically, what happens to these pieces of property a few generations down the road, and we may not be at that point now because it hasn't been around.
Right.
But it could easily get to a point where a family member says, this property is of no value to me, I have to pay taxes on a dead horse, we'll say, and I don't have the money to pay the taxes, I'm just gonna not pay the taxes. And
Well,
it's gonna go back to public, it's gonna go to auction.
No, well, I don't think that's likely to happen. Typically, what's going to happen is somebody will buy the property and manage it as forest land or hunting land or something like that. Just because it can't be developed doesn't mean it can't be used.
Yeah.
As long as forestry is done in a sustainable manner, farming can be done in a sustainable manner. So, the land certainly has value. It doesn't have development value.
In Casanova, we had properties that had conservation easements that would sell all the time. Didn't really affect. We had properties that had conservation easements through the the foundation there that's sold. They transfer all the time. I mean, it just, and some went through generations.
But the restriction stays on the property.
Restriction stays on the property.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's forever open.
Right.
One thing that we've done is sold property with an easement on it to a neighbor that wanted to have the larger property and have a place where they could go and take a hike, basically.
Well, it does retain some value, even if it's not development value, it's still
Right.
got the.
Ag value's still there.
Yeah, ag and forestry.
recreation.
Recreation.
Yep.
Is there any restriction on how much the landowner can alter? Say this was a really wooded area. Can he cut down all the trees?
Not all the trees, because we wouldn't agree to that. The land trust wouldn't agree to that. We want to maintain the natural resource value of the property. So forestry can be done in a sustainable manner, but unless in the unusual circumstance we wanted to manage for a particular species, like for example, if we wanted to do a clear cut and allow aspens to grow for ruffed grouse habitat or something like that, then we could agree to something like that. But typically that's not the case. Typically it has to be managed in a sustainable.
That's in the original agreement, or is it?
We
or is it
typically require that in the original agreement. Yes.
just-
Okay. Any other questions about easements? Certainly don't hesitate to interrupt me and ask it.
Are you gonna cover enforcement probably in your talk?
Yeah. Now, what we do is once we enter into a conservation easement agreement with a landowner, it's our responsibility to monitor that easement. So once a year, we have to check at least part of the property. We may not necessarily cover the entire thing, but we check the property. We used to do it by walking the boundaries and crisscrossing the interior a little bit. It's getting to the point where we're going to do it by drone very soon. So we've got a professor at Colgate who teaches a course on drone aviation, for lack of a better term. I don't know exactly what it is, but he's going to have students help us out by flying drones over the property and taking photos. And so we're going to be able to do it that way. And instead of covering 1 or 2 properties a day, we should be able to cover 6 or 8 or maybe even all of them in one day. Except that we have a 200-acre easement down in the town of Endicott because the Chenango Land Trust covers both Chenango and Broome counties. So that's kind of a long way to go to get the, and a 200-acre property might take a little while to fly the drone over. So we may not get them all in one day, but I'm looking forward to seeing how that works.
100 acres isn't that much.
Well, it's not, but if you have to walk it,
Yeah.
it takes a while.
Takes a while to get to Endicott.
It takes a while to get to Endicott and then walk the property and get back. Yeah, that particular property, by the way, is the IBM Glen, which I don't know if some of you may be familiar with. It's a property that used to be owned by IBM, and the employees would use it as a recreational area where they could go out and walk. IBM sold off about 700 acres, but they preserved 200 acres of the IBM Glen. Donated it to the Waterman Conservation Center, which is the nature center down there, with the understanding that Waterman would immediately put a conservation easement on the property to be held by the Chenango Land Trust. So kind of an interesting relationship there, but it's a great piece of property for us to have the easement on. Okay, so the procedure for us engaging with a landowner, typically a landowner would contact us and talk about what the property that they have and what they want to do with it, and I will then tell them what the options are. And basically the options are putting a conservation easement on it, or having them donate the property to the land trust if they so choose. And then we would put a conservation easement on it and sell it for revenue for the land trust. And so if finances are not an issue for the property owner, they may do that, and a couple of times that has been what's happened. But typically, it's just we agree on the conservation easement contract. So then, after they contact us and I explain the options, we would go out and do a site visit, and the landowner would show us around, and we would probably talk briefly about what rights they want to retain on the property, and we would explain what restrictions we would like to see in the conservation easement. At that point, I would have the landowner then chat with their attorney and come up with a list of the reserved rights that they definitely want to maintain on the property. And then they would let me know what that is, and if it's still in keeping with what we expect for the management of the property, then we would move forward and draft a conservation easement document. Our attorney would look at it, the landowner's attorney would look at it, make whatever changes were necessary, and as long as we were all still in agreement, then eventually we would sign the easement document, and that becomes a real estate transfer because they are giving us an interest in the property. So the typical real estate transfer forms get filled out. The easement gets filed with the county clerk, the DEC, the landowner's attorney, the land trust, and the land trust attorney. Six easement documents get filed with all those different agencies. While the easement is being negotiated, the land trust would create a baseline documentation report, which is a snapshot of what the land looks like at the time of the conservation easement, so that we can compare any future issues with the baseline documentation. And the baseline documentation consists of a series of about 10 different maps, including wetlands, wildlife, recreational uses, topography, photos that we take, nearby lands, a road map. There's all sorts of different maps that get created. We take about probably between 50 and 100 photos, including the boundaries and notable features. We include all sorts of property descriptions, which include the various ecosystems on the property and some detail. Buildings and any other notable features on the property, historic aspects, things like that. The easement document ends up being a report that generally runs between 50 and 80 pages, depending on the size and intricacy of the property. So that document, the baseline data report, baseline documentation report, goes to the landowner and to the land trust. We keep several copies so that we can take one out in the field with us when we go to do a property check. And then keep a copy in the office as well. Okay. The Chenango Land Trust in the past has put out periodic newsletters. However, our numbers of our organization have dwindled to the point where it's getting challenging to do that because we're all volunteer and keeping up with all the properties that we have to manage and working with landowners gets very time consuming sometimes, so we haven't had the wherewithal to get a newsletter put out. But
so what would happen if you had to if your organization had dropped all the volunteers? What happens to those easements?
they would get turned over to another qualified organization. So a neighboring land trust, or if another organization in Chenango County were interested in taking that over, then they would do that. But that's written right into the easement, that every easement would pass on to another organization if the Chenango Land Trust dissolved.
Fred?
Yes.
You said that a copy gets filed with the DEC.
Yes.
What part do they play in the development of the easement?
None whatsoever. They just like to be kept informed of the easements that exist.
Do you happen to know if they keep track of easements for the farmland trusts also that
I
are
have
out
no
there?
idea.
This is the first I've heard of that filing.
Yeah, it goes to the forestry department, so I suspect that that's not the case, but I really don't know.
I'll bet you're gonna cover the costs.
Good question.
That's the bottom line.
Yeah, good question.
I'm getting close to that.
There are costs associated with creating an easement. The property must have a reliable survey. And so if there isn't one that's reliable, that is one of the landowner's responsibilities to have a survey done.
In other words, that means my property, which hasn't estimated, wouldn't quite
Well,
go.
the problem is we have to enforce the boundary, so we kind of have to have an accurate.
I kind of know what my grandfather said.
Right. Right.
Is his
The
father,
tax-
his father.
Some of those big old trees don't exist anymore, so.
Barbed wire in a tree or something.
The county tax map is not a reliable survey.
That is not a reliable
No.
survey.
Not a survey.
Survey,
Transfer of any property, you've got to do a survey.
survey pins, you
Oh
know,
my golly,
that-
imagine
that,
what that'd cost.
yeah, well, it could be several $1,000s for a property. So that's the major cost. The second cost is, in order to take a charitable donation deduction off your income taxes, you have to hire an appraiser to do a comparison of the pre-easement value and the post-easement value, so that you know what the value of the donation is to be deducted. And we've worked with one appraiser who's located in the New Berlin area, and I think they charge in the $1,000 range for a.
So there's, evidently there's different levels or types of surveyors, or, not surveyors, but appraisers. And you could have a guy come in and appraise your house because he sells real estate and he says your house is worth $100,000.
Yeah,
But there's another kind, which is a certified appraiser, and when they do it, it's not necessarily for the sale value, but it would fit into this.
yeah.
But those are very expensive appraisals. So is that the kind of appraisal you're talking about?
It's up to the landowner to determine what they need. It has to be defensible to the IRS.
IRS does look at those periodically, because I've run into that myself.
So it would,
They
so
call
the
me.
IRS would probably say you need to have a certified appraiser.
All appraisers are certified.
Well, I
In
know,
New York
but-
State, but they have different, there's
Different
different
areas of
qualifications
expertise,
that-
yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
yeah. You wouldn't use typically
A
use someone that
realtor.
just does Fannie Mae appraisal. A realtor, most realtors aren't certified appraisers. They're just realtors.
Hmm.
They do a
Yeah,
comparison
the appraiser has to provide you with a report that you would need to produce for the IRS if they asked you for it.
Right.
Or probably the documentation of what they compared it to.
It would have to be, it would have to include at least 3 properties that they compared it to, and, you know, various
So
other
that, it
things.
gets pretty expensive.
Potentially.
tax benefit can be definitely outweighed that expense.
Is there an annual maintenance fee?
No. What we ask is, and this is a guideline that's suggested by the Land Trust Alliance, which is the National Association of Land Trusts. They suggest that a land trust ask landowners during the negotiation of a conservation easement for a $5,000 contribution to the land trust. We realize that in this area, that's not realistic. I mean, that may be true for, you know, places like downstate New York, or, you know, other areas that have a little bit more wealth, for lack of a better phrase. But typically, we've been, and each easement is different too, because the size of the easement will determine how much effort we need to put into it, what the size of the documentation report is going to be, and things like that. So for a large property, We've been asking in the neighborhood of 4,500. For a smaller property, it would be commensurately less.
Brad, have you ever been asked to do an easement to qualify for either of the two government grants?
Have not. No, we have maybe 3 easements now that have current agricultural activity on them, but I'm not aware of what other programs the landowners are involved in. They may be, and I don't know.
When I compared your easement to the ASAP and the FPIG, you use a lot of their wording, so I'm just wondering how that happened.
Yeah, I don't know.
What's your cost of maintaining easement?
Our cost to
Yeah, like-
maintain, we need to do the baseline documentation report, which if we were to hire somebody to do that for us, they typically charge around $1,500 to $2,000, but because I've been involved in this long enough, I'm doing them myself, so the cost is much less. But we need to take photos of the entire property. I don't do the mapping. I do hire out the mapping, which costs about $500 to get somebody to do the mapping of all the different maps. And then we have the annual visitation where we have to check the property. And so, being a volunteer organization, the only thing we can do is charge mileage, basically, for the distance that we travel. And so, however, the biggest expense is only one that's potential, and that is defending the easement if there's a breach of the contract. And breaches of the contract typically occur with future landowners or with neighbors encroaching on the property. And so there are potential legal fees. And so we need to maintain a legal defense fund, basically.
Have you yet had to defend?
We have not legally had to defend. We have had to explain to landowners that they can't do certain things that they have wanted to do, but fortunately it hasn't gone beyond that.
And what are some of those things that you had to explain to the landowner? Can you recall any of them specifically?
There was one that wanted to put a small hydroelectric generating system into a stream, and that in order to do that, they would have had to dam the stream, which we did not want them to do. So we disallowed that, and they could have pursued that in court, but they decided not to, and we would have had to,
So it would have
fight them
changed,
on
that would have changed the baseline configuration of the land, because what you took over as a land trust was a wetlands or something, at least it had
flowing
some
stream.
hydrology in it.
Yes.
So we talked about the trees earlier, but we'll say in this base understanding of the property,
Mhm.
can the landowner or future landowners alter the commercial utilization of that land in any way? I mean, as an example, you take it over and it's a hemp farm.
Mhm.
Okay? Future generations not into hemp, don't want it to be hemp, want it to be apple orchards.
Yeah, they can do that as long as it's in agriculture. It's not.
So he could grow corn, he could grow egg, he could grow fruit trees.
Yeah.
So can he grow any tree?
Well,
Can he let that land, that pasture land, grow up into forest?
there are some considerations. Typically, yes. However, if the easement includes a scenic vista, then it may not. And we don't yet.
What is this?
have
Could be anything. I mean,
Well, it could be, except that in order to qualify for the IRS, it has to be significant. So if you can picture County Route 36 going between Norwich and Guilford, on County Route 36, there's some really nice views. If you look out, you can see toward the west quite a ways. You can actually see into Portland County, and I'm not sure, maybe Broome County as well. But we had a landowner that was considering an easement that would have included one of those scenic vistas looking off to the side. And that qualifies for a conservation easement because it's in the public benefit. In that easement, we would have had to write in that anything grown in those fields could not impede the view. So it would have had to be no taller than, say, for the first 50 feet of the field, no taller than maybe 4 feet. So corn would not have been appropriate. Further down the hill, they could have grown corn, but not near the road where the scenic vista occurred.
Those apple trees would have impeded the view too.
Apple trees would certainly impede the view. So we
So
would write into the easement that certain things could be done in certain areas. That's a very unusual case. Typically, in agricultural land, you can do anything with it because you're not impeding a view necessarily.
So who's responsible for the removal of this, or anything that's done on the land? It's the landowner.
The landowner would be
So
responsible
if the land trust says, that's unacceptable maintenance on the land, you
Right.
have to go in there and brush hog that
Right.
or do something.
Typically, the landowner would check with us first. We hope they would check with us first.
Well, I'm saying the landowner is perfectly happy with it growing up into a brush lot,
Yeah.
but the land trust is not.
Oh, well, no, typically we would allow that because there's no loss. You're not losing the soil. The soil is still there and it could still be used as agricultural land. I can't think of a case where we would require that the land be left as an open field.
That would impede the scenic view. If
It-
brush grows up,
If the easement has that clause in it. But again, we don't have an easement with scenic view quality yet. We almost did last year, but the landowner decided not to pursue it.
So the property owner could do a 480A or forestry management
Absolutely,
program.
we have several of those with that.
And what's the difference between yours, which is kind of Chenango County based, and the American Land Trust, New York State Land Trust?
NIALT is what I think what New York Agricultural Land Trust.
Perpetuity for me.
I'm not familiar with what
the American Farmland.
somebody else can.
Yeah.
Trust.
Oh, the American Farmland Trust is they're a land trust that manages farmland, but I don't know what their,
Criteria. So
well, not criteria so much as the geographic area that they work in.
All in New York State,
Well,
Yeah.
they say that, but really they're working in Onondaga and Cayuga County.
right?
They do a lot of work with the FPIG program, so they're doing a lot with protecting farmland, and they have a lot on their plate to just, focusing on that. And they use up their allotment of how many grants they can apply for. They use them up every year, and they've got a waiting list, so.
And I would expect that if a landowner approached the American Farmland Trust, that they would contact me and talk to me about what's going on, and we would
Okay.
come to some agreement on who's going to manage and, who would hold the easement, things like that.
Okay.
The second owner can rent nice fields to the farm neighbors, correct?
The only restriction that we typically put on an easement that relates to that is that we say that nothing can be taken from the land which is a commercial activity. However, sustainable agriculture and sustainable forestry are permitted uses. So you couldn't invite a well driller to come in and drill for gas on the property, for example. I mean, that type of commercial activity on the property.
If a well driller came in and extracted the gas from a neighboring well underneath the property,
There's nothing we can do about that. Yeah.
So, no.
the property owner gets the royalties off of it. If the property owner wanted to put up a solar array, personal or commercial?
Well, we would have to look, well, commercial, that would be, that's kind of a gray area where we would have to determine whether it compromises the natural resource value of the land. So in other words, if in order to put the solar array on a large area of woodland had to be cut, then that's probably not okay. If it's marginal land, maybe it is okay. You know, some issues go case by case, and that would be probably an example of one that would go
Personal
case by
use?
case. Personal use, hunting, fishing, trapping, recreational use, that's all perfectly acceptable.
New Jersey is doing a lot of this, aren't they?
There are land trusts cover every area of the United States at this point. Yeah, some areas are much more active than others. Some areas have very large land trusts that aggressively pursue pieces of land that they want to protect. We are not one of those. We do not aggressively pursue. We wait for landowners to contact us.
So the major reason for having a land trust is what?
To give landowners an option for protecting their land in perpetuity.
Okay, what about
the taxes?
We talked about that.
Taxes, the landowner is still responsible for taxes.
But it may be of less value.
They are less value, and the tax laws are changing. New York State has not only the charitable contribution, but you can also deduct a portion of the property tax that you pay off your income taxes. But you have to talk to your attorney or your tax preparer to get that information, because every case is different on that.
Well, but I think there might still be some confusion. They shouldn't really be at less value. So if Ken protected his property, which is now in agriculture and is currently being assessed as agriculture, it shouldn't be because he put that assessment on it. It shouldn't be a change in value, right, Steve? That's what you were saying earlier.
We're already assessed at that.
Yeah, you're not being assessed for the development value of your property, which in the Oxford might actually be higher than the ag value, unlike most of the rest of the counties.
So protecting, the purpose of a land trust is for a landowner to protect his property in perpetuity against what?
Well, against inappropriate development, or
Spaghetti lots,
yeah,
turning it into,
So he makes the decision that future landowners are going to have to live with.
yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Is there any way of getting a property out of a conservation easement?
It typically has to be in the best interest of the public in general. It has to be the landowner doesn't want it, and the land trust either loses the court battle or agrees that it may not be in the best interest. Like in a case of eminent domain, an easement could certainly be wiped out.
Probably they'd end up having to pay the taxes that they didn't have to pay earlier, too, wouldn't they?
Well, there would be a huge penalty if the land is not being used according to the conservation easement. But yes, if that change were to take place, then it would go back to the higher value, and there, you know, I don't know how the court would decide, you know, what needed to be paid.
Yeah, capital gains would be.
So if the property were deemed to be valued as a flood control area, and for the greater good, they wanted to put in a dam downstream, not on the property, but that dam downstream is now going to
Affecting the property.
affect the property, that could be done even though,
Well,
or would the land then have to be taken over by whoever built the dam for whatever reason?
I think in a case like that, we would, there would be some negotiation about where the responsibility lies for protecting the property, and the court would have to make a determination as to whether the downstream landowner is going to be responsible for changing the property, or I don't know. In a case like that,
Could come under eminent domain, actually.
it could come under eminent
property's gonna be
domain,
flooded.
and yeah, it
They're gonna take, you know.
Yeah, they're
we're-
gonna take the land anyway.
Yeah.
right. So in a case like that, what we would really try to do is rewrite the easement to fit what the situation has to be based on the eminent domain decision.
In other words, you have the right to rewrite it later on if need be?
Well, if need be is the key phrase. I mean, that has to be a legal decision. That's not at the whim of any party involved. That has to be a legal decision, and it has to satisfy the IRS.
That was me, Ken.
No.
I'm surprised that we're living in a society that's concerned about losing our farmland and losing our trees. We're concerned about pollution and the earth warming. Then, of course, agriculture is a big benefit in everything we grow, absorbs carbon dioxide and gives us back oxygen. I'm surprised that it's still so difficult in our society today to pull this off, and so costly. It's something we should have started doing 50 years ago.
And it's your fault that we didn't.
I guess you're
Why,
right.
I'm not sure why Ken's responsible, but let's hear about that in a minute.
Kind of in response to John's comment, I thought you're leading up to why would you do it? Why would you want to do it? We're on the Ag and Farmland Protection Committee. Supposedly all of us have an interest in what's over those hills out there, and yet you guys are working a lot in your area just to pull us off, and it's so natural and so important. Why is it so damn hard to do
Well.
and costly?
Yeah, well, I mean, remember that like New York State's allocating multiple millions of dollars a year to do it, but for Chenango County, you know, it's like, say nobody's looking to subdivide my property and turn it into something else. Yours might be a little bit different. And we do lose farms to spaghetti lots and subdivision, but it doesn't really change the character of the land, whereas where you really see it in Long Island or Hudson River Valley,
Right.
It's going, like if you don't conserve your farm, it's still gonna probably look a lot like it does now, whereas it's not gonna fill up with houses and industry. So we don't see it here. If you were in Cayuga County, or if you were in Onondaga County or Hudson River Valley or New Jersey, you would see it, or even Cazenovia. There's many properties in Cazenovia that are being conserved because they would get turned into get turned into suburb developments of Syracuse. So I mean, we're in a spot where, you know, there's not the land's not going to convert into.
We don't have the pressure that's.
There's not the development pressure,
There's not
but
development pressure.
but the land trust formed because we wanted to be ahead of that.
Well,
We didn't want to react to it. We wanted to be proactive and you know, exist and be here so that, you know, the folks who wanted to take advantage of it at the early stages could do that, and we had a mechanism in place so that when the development pressure does come, folks have an alternative.
New York State has a different strategy to avoid development in regions like ours. They keep the taxes so high and the opportunity for business development so low that people
Don't come in.
move away, and that reduces the
Oh, there's a
development.
mobile home park that's being built within a mile from my farm,
Yeah,
and I'm gonna turn over in my grave if somebody comes in, puts mobile homes and low-cost this and that, and
Yeah,
jump.
look at all the
don't they have
taxes you're gonna
zoning in
generate
Oxford
for
that
Oxford.
prevents that?
Well,
They're meeting our requirements for that. They've been to us at planning board.
Oh, so the zoning in Oxford would allow for trailers?
It shouldn't, cause it's ag value A1, but we allow it
So is the
year in
zoning
and
board-
year out, and
there's
we
a zoning
shouldn't
board of
be.
appeals that can go against that.
We should be saying, this is ag land, sorry, you can't, but we don't.
There are numerous studies done by landscape architecture students, graduate students, and professors and things like that that indicate that developing land raises taxes more than leaving the land
Right.
open. And so, the argument that we're generating tax revenue by development, that doesn't hold any water, so.
You're developing tax value, not revenue.
Right.
It's the value.
The value of the
Because
house has to be, what is it? I think it's gotta be, the house has to be worth like $375,000 in order for it to pay enough in tax. I think they,
To cover the cost of the
Yeah.
services, the government services that are required to offset that. Yeah.
which in some places that works, but it doesn't work in Oxford.
So
Well,
isn't gonna work around
None of
here.
those trailers is worth
If we talk
$375,000.
development, I've got 463 acres in Guilford. I have road frontage on 3 roads through that property. If I wanted to develop,
It's
I've
a
got-
nice place to
boy,
live.
Guilford would love it if I developed that because 2 of the roads are seasonal. They're down roads.
And
But
what does
y-
it cost?
Getting to
50,000 a mile.
getting to both Ken's remarks and yours to a degree, farm equipment, the manufacturing of farm equipment, the sale of farm equipment, the repair and maintenance of farm equipment, all takes development, all takes a commercial activity. So, and that's farms. So when Ken said, why wouldn't we want to keep all of our land? And certainly I'm for land trust. But like Ken said, no one's coming after our land to develop a new tractor assembly plant. And if they did, that land that could be developed, you could maybe easily transfer some of those building lots along road frontage as an economic income, as an alternative source of income for your farm, and not really lose that much pasture land. You could still operate your farm if you sold 2, 3, 4, 5 lots off of the road
Yeah,
frontage.
I could sell some woodlot areas
Mhm.
and that would reduce my tax.
Yeah, and if you were gonna put an easement on that property, we would just carve out that building area, put an easement on the rest of it, and anything can happen on the part that you separate
And-
out.
And in an effort of trying to have alternate income streams for farms, which is important in a lot of what we're about. You wouldn't want to eliminate that possibility down the road.
And that's something that the landowner would have to seriously think about and require in the easement. And for us, it's simple. You take a piece of land and you set it aside and you don't include that part in the easement. The rest of it gets the easement.
Yeah.
And we do that on all the easements that we have. All the easements we have that have a house on the property, we just exclude that building area from the easement. The easement goes on the property that's not developed. The building is separate, and the owners can do anything they want with the building.
The homestead portion.
Right. Yeah.
Do you-
Typically we separate out 3 to 5 acres where the building area is, so that they could put up another barn or a shed or repair the driveway or whatever it is without having any effect on the rest of the property.
Do you help counsel those landowners who come to you and say, I'd like to put some land because I want it to stay this farm forever? Do you counsel them on, well, maybe you ought to look about or think about that road frontage, that future generations or landowners here may need to or want to do something with some of the land along maybe a road frontage? Or do you not counsel them and say, okay, yeah, we'll suck it all up into a land trust and
We have not encountered a situation yet, well, I shouldn't say that. We have encountered that situation where individuals have wanted to separate out a piece of property on the road for a building lot, maybe for a child or a grandchild or something like that. We haven't actually completed an easement that includes that. Typically I contact, or I'm in contact with maybe 3 or 4 landowners every year that are thinking about an easement. We complete about one every other year, because most of the time, after we talk about what we can do and what the landowner wants, we don't come to an agreement. So typically, in a case like that, I shouldn't say that. In the 2 or 3 cases where that situation has come up, we have not been able to complete the easement. And it's not because of that, it's for other reasons, because we're happy to set aside a piece of property. We always make sure that the landowner contacts their attorney and that they take everything into consideration that they want to. And they know that they can separate pieces out for building areas if they want to. So I'm not sure if that answers your question about counseling.
the landowner is cognizant of the fact that he can separate some areas
Oh,
out.
absolutely.
And if that property never goes into development, it's just the property right next to the easement property.
Right,
It looks the same right out to the road front.
right.
And as Ken alluded to, there's no big manufacturing that's knocking our doors down trying to
Well,
build
the other
here.
thing to think about is,
Without manufacturing, you don't sell homes.
there's some parts of the country, like I was in southern Vermont, where like they couldn't build a school because everything was conserved, because there were rich people in the area and they wanted everything. They conserved every farm. This is where I used to live. And, they had to work like crazy to find a spot. In Chenango County, the percentage of land that's conserved is like 1,000th of 1%.
We have 900 and something acres.
Out of 9,000, so it's literally 1 in 1,000 acres. And so it's not we're not bumping up into any land use challenges. What's that, Pete?
I said, don't forget your 90,000 acres of state land, which some people might consider conserved.
Okay, well, so then,
Which a lot of that's right here in Chenango County.
well, that's what we're talking about, Chenango County. So we're at 1% conserved land if you include state land,
Should we
or
be,
10%, I guess.
as a agricultural board, should we be promoting farmland protection more than we are? What's your conscience vote?
My conscience is that you conserve your property as a demonstration project, and we advertise it heavily in the Evening Sun and the Cooperative Extension. For me, I think when you put a 4,500 or 5,000, which I think is cheap.
Yeah.
When you put a $4,500 price tag on something for Chenango County farmers and landowners,
Yeah.
that stops the conversation a lot of times right there.
It does.
Okay, then we need to get a hold of our state representatives, Assembly and Senate, propose legislation to make it more attractive to the landowner to get this land put aside for ag use and recreation.
It's an interesting discussion to think about how you do that. I mean, to me, the thing that I would suggest, and it's interesting to have Fred here as conversation, is like, if you could just get people to stop chopping it up into spaghetti lots,
Well,
you know.
just stop subdividing so much.
So if a farmer retires and his land is his retirement fund, that he is not compelled to then sell it into, if there's like I live on what used to be a 500-acre farm, which is now
10 landowners.
Now all chopped up into lots that are less than 20 acres. And so that can, you know, it's not that that land can't get reassembled into contiguous pieces because that,
But it's never gonna happen.
well, it has happened, it would probably started as 20-acre lots a lot of times
Right.
and then got assembled into those big pieces.
Yep.
But it can't be farmed. That was like Dennis Brown, I think, started some concern a few years ago because there was the sheep farm that you might not know of in Pharsalia, Ken, that some people from Texas,
Hartman.
and they
But,
came in, they fixed up the house and built beautiful stone fences, and as people often do.
Created
Yeah.
about 1,000 acres because he was running sheep, and he could bring sheep up from Texas, raise them here, take them back to Texas and shear them and get a lot more money than you could here in New York.
Right. Well, as
But his
people
wife
figured
didn't like
out,
it.
it was sheep after the Civil War. Everybody's had pretty much the same experience, which is he lost money until he decided he lost enough, and then they sold it off, and then they chopped it
He
up.
was a millionaire, so losing money was part of the game.
Yeah.
Conservation easements, do you work with many landowners who have mortgages on their property? What happens with the bank?
Yeah, every lien holder would have to sign off on the easement, and banks are not inclined to do that. But
So banks
we have
discourage
not
it.
faced that situation yet. Every landowner we've worked with, and typically the landowner that we work with, the farm has been in the family for several generations, so it's long paid off. And so,
Not unless they keep farming. I'm the 5th generation. I got the mortgage. No.
So-
Mortgage in perpetuity.
Getting back to your point, we're fortunate here in Chenango County, but I'm working with a Farm Bureau leader in Seneca County who has a town supervisor that came out of planning and zoning, and he is literally trying to pass legislation to alleviate farming along a development area. And of course, you know what he's thinking is he can generate more taxes if that gets subdivided. But so not all of New York State is pro-farming, let's put it that way.
Oh,
I think we should move, I think Fred really enlightened us this morning on something we've been wallowing around with here for a while. I think we should move that up to our goals to do a little more promoting from this group and maybe have a few notes on how you do it.
Well, don't forget your constitutional rights.
You know, hey, we got a handout.
Woo-wee.
I think it's number 1.1 anyway, isn't it? Include agricultural land protection and other.
Yeah.
Already in there?
Right. And that's our, and, you know, just looking back, we responded to, back when they wanted to put the Unionville Valley School right on a beautiful piece of flat agricultural land.
Well,
And they basically blew us off that there's plenty of ag land undeveloped
That's where
around
they
it.
love to put schools.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice
Well, you
flat
can
the best
say
property.
that, but if you look at national trends, and we have to feed the world here, we're running out of farmland.
Well,
It's
yeah,
that simple.
yes.
Is that a
Wouldn't disagree with
concern?
it.
are you folks interested in seeing the map of properties that we have protected? Okay. Maybe I don't know if I can lay this out in the middle of the table there.
Get your coffee, Ken.
All right.
So this is north, and we have
But that's,
24 acre easement in Sherburne along Route 12B, a little bit north of the village. 93 acres in Columbus on County Route 41 or 2, I can't remember what the number is. 60 acres, this was our first one in Pharsalia.
Yeah.
McCall's Pond, 20 acre wildlife, we call it a wildlife sanctuary that we own. This is our newest one, 76 acres in Guilford on Guilford Lake. Chenango Canal Lock 99, we have only 1 acre there, but it includes the lock and the aqueduct that carried the canal across Bowman Creek. 50 acres in Smithville, I'm sure you're all familiar with that. That's the 1,200 acre farm that got subdivided.
Tarbell.
Tarbell, yes. Yeah. Tarbell. And the developer, before selling off the property, put a 50-acre an easement on 50 acres along the corridor of the Chenango Creek. And then he sold the property off to the landowners with the easement on it. So that was a real nice, real nice effort on his part. 10 acres. This one is on a wooded hillside that goes down into a creek that feeds the Chenango. And this is one that was donated to us that we sold to the neighboring landowner. 133 acres in the town of Greene, and then down in Broome County we have 70 acres in the town of Maine, the IBM Glen, which is 200 acres in the town of Union, and then a 200-acre piece over in the town of Sanford.
Well, we're way ahead of Broome County, aren't we?
We are. Broome County thought about getting a land trust going many years ago, but they just didn't get it together, I guess, and so we decided that we would cover that area. So that's kind of taken the pressure off of them a little bit. So. It would be nice if they got one going so that I didn't have to drive from Sherburne all the way down there. But that's the way it is. So.
Okay, any more questions? I'd like to thank Fred for the presentation. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Certainly, my
The
pleasure.
enlightenment is what we needed.
No?
Yes, and I hope to hear from some of you soon.
Do you have any questions for us?
Not at this time. You know, I feel unfortunately very ignorant of a lot of the farmland-related programs that might dovetail with what we do at the Chenango Land Trust, and so I need to do some research about that. But I'm at a level where I don't even know what to ask at this point yet. So I have to do a little reading, and Sandy's helping me understand what I need to learn about because she's pressuring me a little bit.
I've got, 64 acres in conservation reserve with FSA, Farm Service Agency, Soil and Water. But it's because to sign up, I got paid $100 an acre to sign up.
Yeah.
Pretty good reason.
Each year for 10 years. After 10 years, but that land I'm supposed to keep mowed at least every 3 years and maintain fencing around.
Yeah, we had property like that at Rogers Center too. When I was working there, we had conservation reserve property that we had to have.
That's a
Same
benefit to me that I get paid to have it.
Yeah.
But the program's no longer that strong due to budgeting.
Here's you can join Chenango County Farm Bureau and we'll definitely update you on agriculture. And you're welcome to one of our board meetings if you'd like to do an explanation.
And you're welcome to join us the third Friday every month we meet here.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.